The laws of exponents and radicals.
Multiplying variables with exponents. When multiplying variables with exponents, you add the exponents. In this example, you have x to the second times x to the fourth. You add the 2 and the 4, and you end up with x to the sixth. Dividing variables with exponents. When you're dividing variables with exponents, you take the exponent in the denominator and subtract it from the exponent in the numerator. In example 2, you have x to the 8th divided by x to the 5th. You subtract 5 from 8 and end up with x to the 3rd. Multiplying exponents in parentheses. If you're multiplying exponents in parentheses, you multiply the exponents. In example 3, you take x raised to the 5th raised to the 2nd. You multiply 5 times 2 and you're left with x to the 10th. Multiplying variables with negative exponents. When you multiply variables with negative exponents, you take the variable with the negative exponent and put it under 1, and make the exponent positive. In example 4, you have x to the 11th times x to the negative 7th. You multiply the x to the 11 by 1 over x to the 7th, and end up with x to the 11th over x to the 7th. Then you subtract 11 from 7 and end with x to the 4th. Dividing variables with negative exponents. When dividing variables with negative exponents, take the variable with the negative exponent and move it to either the numerator or the denominator and change the exponent to a positive. In example 5, you have x to the negative 5th divided by x to the 2nd. Move the x to the negative 5th to the denominator and make it a positive. Then add the 2 and the 5 and be left with 1 over x to the 7th. Distributing exponents. If you have an exponent outside of parentheses, you need to multiply the exponents in the parentheses to the one outside. In example 6, you see x to the 5th plus y to the 2nd all raised to the 7th. Multiply the 5 and 7, and then the 2 and the 7, and then you'll end up with x to the 35th plus y to the 14th. Distributing and dividing exponents in parentheses. When distributing and dividing exponents in parentheses, you will multiply the exponent outside the parentheses to both exponents in the denominator and the numerator. In example 7, you take the 2 and multiply it by the 6 and the 4. Then you subtract 8 from 12 and end with x to the 4th. Adding radicals. When you are adding radicals, you can only add radicals with the same numbers under them. In example 8, you have the square root of 32 plus the square root of 48. Simplify the radicals by making the square root of 32 into 2 times the square root of 16, then 2 times 4, and get 8. Make the square root of 48 into 3 times the square root of 16, and multiply 3 times 4 and get 12. Add 12 and 8 and end with 20. Subtracting radicals. When you subtract radicals, you can still only subtract the radicals with the same numbers under them. In example 9, you have the square root of 63 minus the square root of 28. Simplify them by making them 3 times the square root of 7 minus 2 times the square root of 7, and that equals to the square root of 7. Multiplying radicals. When you multiply radicals, you multiply the numbers under the radicals and then simplify it. In example 10, you have the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. That gives you the square root of 45, and then you simplify it to 3 times the square root of 5. Dividing radicals. When you divide radicals, you must simplify it first and then divide the numbers outside the radical. In example 11, you have the square root of 12 divided by the square root of 8. You simplify it to 2 times the square root of 3 divided by 2 times the square root of 2. And the 2's cancel out, so it becomes the square root of 3 over the square root of 2.
The math party is that way. A thing